The sky changed in less than a minute. One moment, it was a bright afternoon over Chicago. The next, the sun simply vanished. People looked up in confusion as a strange shadow rolled across the city, stretching like an endless eclipse. It wasn't the moon. No natural object moved like that. Above the Earth, massive ships the size of cities had entered orbit. They belonged to the Varnak Empire, a species that had never seen sunlight, born in the dark heart of a dying star system. To them, darkness was comfort, control, and power. They believed fear was something that grew in the absence of light, something they could use to dominate new civilizations. Most species they had conquered had fallen apart the moment the lights went out. Their enemies trembled when the stars disappeared. The Varnak expected the same from Earth. But Earth, as always, was not so simple. Captain Mara Voss stood on the command deck of Earth's defense station, just above the planet, watching the alien ships cast their massive shadows over North America. She was a quiet woman, steady, not easily moved by fear. Her team waited for orders, watching her instead of the screens. Mara only narrowed her eyes and whispered, "They think the dark will scare us." No one responded, but the mood shifted. Because it wasn't just a phrase, it was a warning. The Varnak made no effort to talk. Their message came in the form of silence and pressure, a psychological tactic. They darkened the planet to show dominance. Entire cities lost power. Satellites were jammed. Broadcasts went silent. Governments tried to send out peace signals, but nothing was returned. The world should have been in chaos. But strangely, humanity did not panic. In New York, people lit candles like it was a citywide blackout. In rural towns, people gathered outside and stared at the dark sky like they were waiting for fireworks. The Varnak didn't know that humans had lived through centuries of darkness, wars, storms, and blackouts far worse than this. They didn't know that children told scary stories in the dark for fun, that miners worked miles below the earth, or that some of the most dangerous human operations happened in silence and shadow. The Varnak assumed light was safety and darkness was fear. But they didn't understand Earth's history. Humans had long ago learned to live without light, and sometimes even preferred it. As the Varnak ships moved into position, Captain Voss gave quiet orders. Her voice didn't rise. No shouting, no panic, just clear, simple instructions. She knew what was coming. She had studied the Varnak for months through intercepted transmissions. They used fear as their first weapon. But fear didn't win wars. Understanding did. Her ships didn't attack. Not yet. Instead, she powered down non-essential systems, lights off, noise down. She let the Varnak believe they had silenced Earth. It was all part of the plan. And below, in the cities and mountains and deep forests, human forces began to prepare, not with bright lights and open fire, but with quiet steps and calm minds. Night vision gear was handed out. Communications switched to low-band frequencies. Engineers took the power offline on purpose, cutting their own grids to prevent hacking. In a world where most species feared the dark, humans chose to enter it willingly. That's what the Varnak never expected. They had come as conquerors in the shadows. But they didn't realize Earth's people had already made peace with the dark long ago. And when the last light went out, and the world fell into deep, unnatural blackness, Captain Mara Voss smiled quietly to herself. Not because she was fearless, but because she knew something the Varnak didn't. She knew that when humans couldn't see the way forward, they didn't freeze. They adapted. Always had. The first real battle between Earth and the Varnak didn't happen with bright lasers or loud explosions. It happened in silence, in places no one could see, in corners of space and Earth where light had vanished completely. High above the planet, Earth's defense fleet met the Varnak in low orbit, but it wasn't a fair fight. The Varnak ships were made for darkness. They had no external lights, no sound, no heat. They came like shadows with claws, and they struck, fast and hard. Human ships, used to visual systems and coordination, were caught off guard. Communications failed. Targeting systems were confused. Several cruisers were lost within minutes, vanishing into the black without a trace. But while the Varnak believed they had crippled Earth's defense, something strange happened. Instead of retreating or begging for peace, the remaining human ships simply disappeared. Not destroyed, just gone from scanners. Engines cold, weapons silent. They didn't make a sound. It was like they had melted into the night. Captain Mara Voss, still leading from the shadows above Earth, had seen enough. She issued a quiet command. Project Black Echo is live. All across the globe, human cities went dark, not from enemy action, but by human choice. Entire power. Grids were shut down on purpose. Homes, factories, and military bases turned off their lights, their signals, and their presence. At first, the people of Earth were confused, but then they understood. This was not a surrender. It was a new strategy. If the Varnak believed darkness was their domain, then humans would meet them there, face to face. Soldiers trained for jungle warfare, urban combat, and low-light missions were deployed. They moved without noise, without light, using infrared, goggles, and silent gestures. Old technology was pulled out of storage, gear that didn't need satellites or signals. Walkie-talkies, flash-coded lights, paper maps, and even handwritten notes returned. It wasn't weakness, it was control. The Varnak, used to enemies running in fear, started to hesitate. Their scouts reported movement in cities that should have been abandoned. Their scans showed strange heat signatures, brief flashes of human activity, then nothing. Something was watching them, always just out of reach. Varnak soldiers entered dark tunnels and never came back. Their own night vision systems began to glitch, overloaded by sudden flares of heat or cold. They couldn't see clearly anymore, and that frightened them. They didn't know that humans had built entire cities underground, or that some of Earth's most dangerous training happened in complete darkness. They didn't know about the deep mines, the sealed bunkers, or the ancient subway systems that twisted beneath the surface. They didn't understand that humans didn't just survive in the dark, they prepared in it. On board one of the Varnak command ships, a general growled in frustration. Every time they tried to trap human forces, they found nothing. They expected panic, but instead they found silence. The Varnak knew war through fear, but humans didn't seem afraid. They were waiting, listening, watching. It was as if the darkness itself had turned against the invaders. The humans had started to use sound as a weapon. Faint whispers filled the air before an ambush. Echoes bounced down metal halls, footsteps that never reached their source. Soldiers swore they saw figures moving between shadows, only to find nothing when they turned to look. The fear that the Varnak had once used so confidently now began to turn inward. They had stepped into the dark to break humanity's will, but instead, they had entered a place where humanity had already learned to thrive. And somewhere, in the silence between starships, in the still air of abandoned cities, in the empty tunnels that led deep below, a new truth began to form. The Varnak hunted in the dark, but now something hunted them back. In the once bright city of Kyoto, now nothing more than shadow and silence, something changed in the war. The ruins stood still under the dim glow of a distant moon, broken buildings, leaning like quiet watchers over the cracked streets. Inside the underground subway tunnels, long abandoned and without power, a Varnak hunting team moved carefully. Their armor gleamed faintly in the dark, eyes glowing with infrared scans as they stepped over shattered glass and silent rails. They had followed heat signatures down here, human ones, but what they didn't realize was that the signs had been planted, set up like a trail by the very people they thought were running. No alarms, no resistance, just a cold quiet that wrapped around them like a trap. One by one, the Varnak disappeared. No shots fired, no warnings, just a slow fading of signals from their comm units. The deeper they went, the less they understood, until nothing was left but static and darkness. Across space, far from Earth's surface, another kind of silence was spreading. Small, dark objects had been drifting through the black for days, old escape pods stripped of power, floating without heat, no engines, no lights. The Varnak ignored them at first, thinking they were debris. But these weren't empty. Inside them, human space marines waited in full stealth gear, trained to stay still, to breathe slow, to wait for the right moment. When the pods latched onto the hulls of Varnak ships, they opened quietly, and the humans slipped inside like shadows. There were no alarms, because no systems were triggered. One by one, critical sections of Varnak vessels shut down. Lights flickered, engines stalled, and crews vanished. Not because of explosions, but because of quiet, careful action. No one saw it happen, but the effects were impossible to ignore. The Varnak, used to overwhelming fear and fast control, now found themselves being hunted by something they couldn't see. Captain Mara Voss watched all of this unfold from orbit, tracking operations without speaking much. She knew the moment had come. She activated Project Nightfall, a psychological mission more powerful than any weapon. Human intelligence teams began inserting coded messages into Varnak communication systems. Simple stories, easy to believe, but hard to ignore. Whispers of a new enemy called the Lightless Ones began to spread through the alien ranks. Ghost-like figures that didn't need oxygen or heat, who moved unseen through space, striking silently in places where no one else could survive. Varnak soldiers began to report strange things, seeing figures in the corner of their vision, hearing soft footsteps where no one was walking, or watching their teammates vanish without explanation. Some thought it was malfunction. Others began to believe the stories. Fear, once their greatest weapon, now turned against them. Their commanders demanded logic and control, but control was slipping. On one Varnak ship, a soldier refused to enter a maintenance corridor after he claimed he saw a face with no eyes, staring from the darkness. On another, a crew locked themselves in the control room, too afraid to patrol the outer decks. The stories kept growing, feeding off the unknown, and Captain Voss didn't try to stop them. She encouraged the mystery, allowed the fear to grow, not with lies, but with half-truths the enemy couldn't disprove. Every strange sound, every sudden blackout, every missing soldier became part of a legend the Varnak couldn't fight. It wasn't just about technology anymore. It was about belief. And now, the Varnak believed they were being hunted by something unnatural. But the truth was simpler and far more human. These were not monsters. These were people who had grown up in storms, power outages, long nights, and silent dangers. They had learned to live without light and to fight without being seen. The turning point had arrived. The Varnak thought they controlled the dark, but now they were learning, too late, that humans had made the darkness their home and turned it into something terrifying. The stars should have offered comfort, but to the Varnak, they had become a reminder of something they no longer understood. High Command, growing desperate after weeks of silence, sabotage, and vanished fleets, decided to act with full force. They issued a final command across the occupied regions of Earth: total blackout. Every last source of light on the planet was to be removed. The goal was to plunge humanity into hopeless darkness and force them into surrender. But what they didn't realize was that Earth didn't resist the blackout. It welcomed it. Entire continents, already aware of what was coming, shut off their remaining power by choice. Cities disappeared without a sound. Communication towers went silent. Electric grids fell one by one, not because they were attacked, but because humans wanted it that way. The Varnak waited for signs of surrender, but none came. Their scanners found no signals, no life signs, and no movement. But it wasn't because Earth was empty. It was because Earth was hiding. And worse, the fear that had once belonged to others now began to grow inside the Varnak themselves. Their soldiers hesitated to move forward. Patrols refused to enter large buildings without light. Some even began carrying torches and small flares, preferring to risk visibility rather than face whatever might be waiting in the shadows. In orbit, the battle turned colder, quieter. Human ships no longer fought directly. Instead, they drifted, coated with radar-absorbing material, their engines off, body temperatures reduced to blend with the background of space. They became invisible not just to scanners, but to the eye. Slowly, without warning, these ships moved through the Varnak fleet, slipping between cruisers and battleships like whispers. One by one, the Varnak flagships lost power. Entire bridges went dark. Weapons stopped responding. Communications turned to static. And in the middle of it all, only a single repeating message echoed through the void in a calm human voice. "Now you're in our world." The words weren't loud, but they traveled through every Varnak channel, untouched by their firewalls. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Crews aboard the great Varnak warships began to abandon posts. Some locked themselves in storage bays. Others requested immediate recall. A few even turned on their own officers, demanding escape. No one knew how many humans were out there or where they would strike next, but the fear of not knowing was stronger than any weapon. Captain Mara, Voss, hidden aboard her own stealth ship, monitored every whisper and signal. She said nothing. There was no need to broadcast confidence when the enemy had already begun doubting their own strength. Her fleet had become invisible hunters, each strike designed not just to disable, but to unsettle. In one case, a Varnak vessel was found, floating with no power, its crew missing, but with a single light blinking on the bridge, just enough to read a human phrase scratched onto the wall: "Turn off the lights." What began as confusion became full paranoia. Some Varnak soldiers refused to enter shadowed corridors. Some even asked for transfer to daylight planets. But there was no daylight left. The Varnak had brought the darkness, but now they couldn't control it. The power of their ancient strategy, silencing their enemy with fear, was now being used against them. The humans hadn't just adapted to the dark, they had claimed it, reshaped it into a battlefield where the Varnak were blind and lost. This was not a war of weapons anymore. It was a war of the mind. Earth didn't need more ships or stronger guns. It only needed patience and shadows. And while the stars still burned in the distance close to home, it was no longer clear who truly ruled the night. What had started as an invasion had become something else entirely. The Varnak had turned off the lights to break humanity. But in doing so, they had entered the very world humans had mastered. And now, the night belonged to them. The war ended not with an explosion or final battle, but with silence. In the early hours of what should have been another dark day, the final transmission from the Varnak Emperor crackled across long-range frequencies, broken and almost unreadable. His voice, once strong and proud, now trembled with something that sounded like disbelief, or perhaps fear. The words were rough, the translation shaky, but their meaning was clear enough. "We underestimated your kind. The darkness obeys you." Then, nothing more. One by one, Varnak ships began pulling back. Their fleets stopped advancing, and their soldiers no longer landed on Earth's surface. In orbit, empty vessels drifted. In silence, some abandoned, others disabled. No official surrender was sent. No peace treaty was signed. The Varnak simply left. The skies above Earth, once filled with shadow and metal, slowly cleared. The clouds returned. The stars peeked through again. And finally, after weeks of darkness, the sun rose over the horizon, casting golden light across forests, oceans, and broken cities. But humanity had changed during those long nights. There were no celebrations in the streets, no loud cheers or fireworks. Instead, there was quiet rebuilding. People emerged carefully from shelters, blinking at the light as if they had forgotten how it felt. Engineers began repairing grids. Families cleared debris. Soldiers helped without needing orders. The world was not cheering, it was healing, and perhaps that was more powerful than any parade. On board the command ship Ragnarok, now positioned silently above the Earth, Captain Mara Voss stood at the viewport, watching the planet slowly come back to life. The stars above no longer felt cold or distant. They felt earned. Beside her, crew members moved quietly, running system checks, exchanging brief updates. But no one spoke of victory, because this was not a story about winning a war. It was a story about becoming something new. Voss's eyes followed the light creeping across the Earth's curve, warm and slow. She didn't smile, but her voice carried a calm certainty as she spoke, not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to herself, or maybe to the silent stars. We were never afraid of the dark. We were just waiting for someone to follow us in. And those words, though simple, held a truth the galaxy would not forget. Earth had not just survived the invasion, it had owned it. It had taken the enemy's greatest weapon and turned it into a shield, then a blade. Other worlds would hear the stories soon, of ships that vanished without a sound, of soldiers who moved like ghosts, of cities that turned off their lights, not in fear, but in challenge. Across distant systems, the name humanity would be spoken with caution, perhaps even with a sense of respect. Not because of numbers or power, but because of adaptability, patience, and the deep, quiet strength of those who had faced darkness and refused to bow. As the day went on, messages from other colonies and outposts began to come in. Survivors. Fighters. People who had followed Earth's lead and endured. Humanity wasn't just alive. It was united in a way it had never been before. There was work ahead, of course. Rebuilding would take years. Trust between nations would need to grow. Stronger. But something deeper had settled across the planet. A shared memory of shadows, and a quiet promise that if the dark ever came again, it would not find them afraid. Captain Voss remained at her post long after the others had gone to rest. The stars continued to appear one by one, as if the sky itself was rebuilding. And somewhere out there, beyond the light, the Varnak would remember what they had seen. Not weapons, not armies, but people who understood silence, people who walked into the dark and made it theirs.